So the most watched Apple TV Plus show that none of the people in your circle has ever watched just finished its second season, and there's a very distinct feeling that the show elicits. It feels as though the show dares to not treat you like an idiot. It is certainly smart, but it doesn't try to fool you, or impress you, or needlessly pull your leg and proceed to make a fool of itself in the process. It doesn't seek to do something that it isn't. It is a very distinct feeling that not a lot of shows create. The finale, as divisive as it might become, encapsulates this perfectly. Think of the epithets that might come to your mind about a finale. Shocking, yes, certainly. Even a bit unexpected. But that shock doesn't come because the show pulls something out of its ass at the very last second. I think it is shocking because it works with what it already has and stays true to its characters and itself. I watched the show, and whenever a reveal hits, it's never something like, oh my god, no way. It is always like, oh my god, of course, and oh my god, that is actually so reasonable. It is absolutely remarkable just how well the show carries itself. So, to kick off this praise tour of Severance, I think it is best to start with all the answers that we got to some of the mysteries within the show. Fair warning, if I sound different, that is because I'm kinda sick. Anyway, so shout out to all the online theorizers. People have come up with all sorts of theories about what exactly Lumen is actually doing. Various things were speculated like clones, reincarnations of Kier, whatever. But I really like how the show handles these reveals. Because it is nothing as outlandish as clones, it is nothing really extreme. The primary explanation is that Lumen is basically testing their chips out, and they want to sever people away from unpleasant experiences. It makes absolute sense, and I actually love this reveal, because this is exactly what a science fiction show should be. At the core of the show, the idea is, what if you could basically partition yourself in such a way that you could forget the parts you don't want to remember? The show then proceeds to run wild with this idea. It draws you in first with the obvious, the advantage of being able to forget the boring work. And doesn't that sound just peachy? Well, then the show flips the script on the entire idea by pointing out the obvious downside. If you splinter yourself, you inevitably would create a whole nother person. Creating another personality and then tethering it to do your bidding through the most unpleasant parts of your day obviously poses some very interesting ethical implications. So it is all the more fitting that the reveal stems directly from these ideas. I mean, duh, of course it was about exploiting the technology for the thing that Mark used it for. Like, severing from unpleasant experiences is literally what Mark did. And the reveal is essentially that Lumen is trying to perfect the technology to use it for exactly that. Again, the show didn't try to be all weird about it. The reveal is reasonable, and not some outlandish idea pulled out for the wow factor. It didn't go for some cheap thrills expecting the audience to go apeshit over it. Another major reveal during the second season is that Harmony Cobell is the one who originated the Severance chips. Now, this reveal kinda came unexpectedly, but I cannot say that it doesn't make sense. It certainly recontextualizes the whole character of Cobell, and more importantly, it doesn't really conflict with anything we know about her or what we have already seen her do. The show does something practically mythical. It pulls out a reveal, but it doesn't retcon stuff from the past or rewrite it. I freaking love the fact that the show kind of subverts the expectations with Cobell, since, and I am exposing myself here, I always kind of assumed she was just a bit nutty and some dumb Kier cult lady. And you usually don't automatically assume that people like that possess enough mental capacity to invent something as sophisticated as the Severance chip. Cobell literally went from being kinda cuckoo to being the most smart out of the entire cast with a single reveal. I also appreciate the places where the show doesn't draw things out unnaturally. For instance, the season finale of the first one had that lingering question of who exactly is alive, since Mark shouted that she's alive at everyone. Season 2 kinda ponders what that means with the outie characters, and Mark is ready to try and figure it out, and then Regabi, the sketchy woman from season 1, straight up shows up and tells him right out the gate that Gemma is alive. Regabi as a character is a bit meh, but it was a great moment. I feel like if the show was dumber, it would have tried to mine drama out of this and would have left it to hang there until the end of season or something. Which brings us to another thing that the show excels at. That is character writing. I feel like what the show absolutely nails is just how the characters behave. It truly feels like characters are always just behaving, I don't know, like people? And it really shows with characters like Devin. She's the sister of Mark. The one scene that will always stand out to me happens at the end of the first season, when the Innies manage to go to the outside world. Mark goes to talk to Devin, and she of course at first is a bit confused, but she actually sits down and listens to Mark. I feel like if it was any other dumbass show, not me losing my voice, but the show must go on. I feel like if it was any other dumbass show, Devin would suddenly begin acting weird and not believe Mark or whatever. But Devin literally sits down and entertains him. She doesn't do stupid shit just for the sake of the plot or to create suspense. She actually just listens. And I appreciate that so much. And then after that happens and outie Mark returns, she actually just talks to him about what happened straight up. Listen, I love Devin as a character in general. I would protect her rights and her wrongs. I don't care. fair. The show takes this approach with basically every character. You never feel like characters are acting dumb for plot reasons. The show almost never makes you think that they are being mysterious just because. It almost always is very reasonable. Characters don't just go around generating needless frustration. The one scene that you might think is not really in line with that is the choice that Mark makes in the finale. Now, if you don't recall, he gets asked by Audi Mark to help smuggle out his wife out of Lumen. Mark initially waffles around that and kinda says no, but he does end up helping her get out of the severed floor. But then instead of leaving with her, he straight up turns around and goes to Heli. This moment might be divisive, but I really feel like it shouldn't be. What I like about the way this all goes down is that the writing suggests that the writers actually understand the character of Mark. You might say, well, duh, but I feel like in general, understanding of character is taken for granted sometimes. There is sometimes a palpable difference between how we perceive characters should behave due to our own biases and experiences, and how these characters actually should behave. Usually, TV shows tend to steer more and more into the former territory. For example, in my previous video, I bitched and moaned about how Rhaenyra Targaryen behaved pretty freaking weird, considering that she was an ultra-privileged princess that lived in a royal bubble her entire life. She was basically this extra moral person because the writers wanted for her to be that way instead of it actually being sensical for her to actually be that way. Does that make sense? Which doesn't really feel authentic in the context of her circumstances. This show instead chooses the latter approach. It actually considers what it would be like to be these characters instead of imposing some other ideas onto them. You may disagree with this decision on a visceral level since it isn't something that you would want to happen, but you cannot say that it doesn't fit within Mark's point of view. In general, I feel like what this type of character writing suggests is that the show simply has something to actually say about these characters. And what I am referring to is this general trend of shows beginning to give character storylines that don't really do anything besides pad out screen time. I don't feel like that happens here. Severance doesn't feel the need to go for the low IQ solution of throwing in a love triangle for additional drama just because. And now I'ma get a bit freaky for a moment. The one thing that I always look out for in any science fiction or fantasy show is world building. World building is just something that very naturally jumps out to me. I like to appreciate both the foreground and the background of a scene, if that makes sense. So when I say that the world building of Severance is great, I truly mean that it slaps so hard. For me personally, world building can really make or break a TV show. I am one of those people that really value when a TV show puts its time in fleshing out the world around characters. And just in general, world building in science fiction is crucial to get right due to the nature of the genre in general. Severance has done that to such an extent that it is truly admirable. I love the fact that the entire world of Severance feels very grounded and cohesive. Whatever idea they introduce, it feels authentic to that world. It feels like it is in theme and it feels like it makes freaking sense. My biggest tangential interest in this world is just the Egan family lore. I love the Egan family lore. A tidbit of lore that sticks out to me is the whole thing with Woe's Hollow. I absolutely love the story of Dieter Egan. I mean, it might be made up for propaganda by Lumen, of course, and it's just a bit whack as a story, but I do like the way it kind of resembles the Severance procedure itself. Kier and Dieter, a good twin and an evil twin, Innie and Outie. It does contribute a lot to the image of Severance. It adds this layer of mysticism to it, if that makes sense. But also, the frigging names of all the Egans. Oh my god, I might be completely alone in this, but I am the type of a person who can easily be taken out of a story if characters have dumb names. But even the names of the Egans and just all the characters in general feel so in theme. Does that even make sense? I don't know. Maybe it's just the fever kicking in. I don't know. And even things like birthing cabins and Severance being used outside of Lumen for different purposes, and the protests that we see in season 1, and all of the people talking about their own perspectives about Severance, and people stigmatizing others for having the Severance procedure done onto them. It really makes a world's difference, literally. It makes the world of Severance feel alive and actually lived in. And in all of these regards mentioned so far, the first season set a very high bar. But did season 2 actually live up to that bar? So enough with the praise, and let's talk some smack. So let's take a look back on March 7th of the year of 2025, also known as the day that the 8th episode of Severance aired, because while Severance has delivered great content, it is this day that delivered the show's worst rated episode. So here's what happened that day. I watched the episode called Sweet Vitriol. The plot of the episode focuses completely on Harmony Cobell, and this is where the aforementioned reveal of her being the creator of the Severance chip happens. I remember liking the episode just fine, but then I go online and, oh boy, I was kind of surprised to find out just how much people people didn't like the episode. Now, I must recognize that my own liking of the episode is probably very much colored by the fact that I am very into world building. This entire episode was very heavy on that front. It introduced us to an entire town that Lumen basically ruined. It also gave us some examples of just how hard Lumen can ruin someone's life. It expands the world very nicely in that regard. But I can also recognize that this episode doesn't really sit well within the season itself. As it stands, the episode has a rating of 6.7 stars on IMDb, which makes it the lowest ever score across Severance's run so far, but I don't feel like that was entirely justified. Yes, the episode isn't perfect, but it certainly isn't 6.7, come on now. This episode kind of highlights one of the larger problems within the second season. The way information is distributed is a bit weird. It is a bit of an unforgiving situation because it makes sense as to why they would want to have this reveal in there. This sets up an argument as to why Cobell would turn against Lumen. But then you remember that this episode comes right after the best episode in the entire show, where we get our big reveal about what is up with Gemma. I feel like this episode is a weird pace breaker because without it, episodes 7, 9, and 10 form a nice sequence for the finale of the show. I like it as an episode, but it is very awkwardly placed in there. But at the same time, I am not sure how else they should have handled it. I really have no idea. Maybe interweave Cobell's storyline into other episodes? I don't know. But it isn't really just this episode that kind of suffers from awkward pacing issues. So I told you that Regabi comes in and just clarifies to Mark that his wife is alive, right? Well, then she proceeds to suggest him the reintegration procedure, which is supposed to join the innie and the outie together to piece together a whole person. And at first Mark says hell no, but finding out that Gemma is alive is exactly what pushes him to go and do the procedure. Then in episode 3, we see Regabi do some wee woo woo techno stuff on him, and basically trigger some memories from his innie. That is all fine and cool. I assume that the reintegration was beginning. Then we see some glitching and stuff. That is all fine. In narrative terms, reintegration is slowly escalating and it is clearly a process. Then Mark has doubts and tells Regabi to piss off. But then Regabi does something that is supposed to speed up the process. I mean, the show says this.
We need to speed up the process. We'll flood the chip itself.
Okay, cool, seems like a big deal, no? I mean, she literally cuts his head open and injects some mysterious substance directly into his brain. The show certainly presents it this way, because then Mark begins exhibiting some very concerning symptoms and straight up collapses on the floor. This entire sequence then leads to the flashback episode where we see his story with Gemma. Great episode, by the way, if you haven't already gathered that. Now, I feel kinda dumb, because maybe I just didn't understand some deep subtext that is hidden somewhere but is actually in plain sight and everyone has already entangled the mystery except for me. But this reintegration stuff really pissed me off, because then we get the Cobell episode, which chronologically takes place at a similar time as Gemma reveal episode. But then in episode 9, Mark and his sister connect with Cobell, and she suggests to go to a birthing cabin, a place where a Severance chip would be activated outside of Lumen, and Cobell would be able to talk to any Mark. I mean, the writing for them coming together was already a bit iffy. Considering that I don't feel like Mark and Devin asked enough questions of Cobell and kind of trusted her a bit too fast, it doesn't really break my enjoyment or immersion, but this is one of those rare instances where more questioning would have been appreciated. And then even more confusingly, they get to the cabin and find quite a creative way for Mark to talk to himself. Outie Mark tells Innie Mark that he promises him that he would undergo reintegration.
I will finish the process.
Regabi also remains a weaker part of an overall excellent show. Her character purpose is to basically swoop in, push the plot forwards, and then disappear into the night again. I am not saying that it doesn't make sense or it is necessarily bad, it is just a bit meh. Like, I am not going into the Apple Health app to crash out over it, if that makes sense. I feel like the way they presented the reintegration really wasn't the greatest. It's a bit confusing because, again, I assumed that things would really shift when Mark collapsed and had a flashback episode. But none of that really factors into the finale in any way. There is no payoff during the season for that. But then again, some other things also didn't necessarily receive huge payoffs either. I believe that a huge difference between the structures of the first and the second seasons lies in the fact that season 1 had a way more focused and defined goal for the main 4 characters. The last episode quite nicely paid off their collective goal of finding out more about themselves and giving some answers as to who some characters are. It worked as a way better finale in a sense that payoff was more cohesive between all of the main characters. The second season's finale ticks a bit differently. story. Because there are characters like Dylan and Irving, who were not as involved in the main storyline of rescuing Gemma. Dylan was off doing his own thing with his outies wife Gretchen, so he was isolated from everyone else. I did like that the show put that little consideration in and how it approached the situation, and I love the payoff for outie Dylan sort of accepting and affirming the existence of any Dylan. That's kind of sweet. But the storyline does sort of exist outside of the perceived main storyline, aka Mark and his wife. That might have been the purpose though. Kinda same for Irving. He gets straight up fired from Lumen and is off doing his own thing with Bert. He isn't even in the finale, so the narrative cohesion is just not really there per se. Thematically sure maybe, but narrative is more fractured than in the first season. I would be crashing out over all of this, but I am not, because frankly, Severance isn't like other shows, and I'm tired of pretending otherwise. There has been an overwhelming sentiment lately of people pointing out how some shows feel like they were written by AI, or how they feel like they were made to be background noise. Listen, I am not sure how much I agree with that statement. Maybe I am a naive idiot, but I just don't find myself agreeing that some shows were designed to be slop, because those shows still have writers attached to it. I feel like people might be underestimating other people's talent at being bad at their jobs. Does that make sense? What I think is really happening is that entertainment in general is just becoming, and it already has become, more commercial rather than a way of art and expression. It isn't necessarily a bad thing, because there still has to be commercial interest in there to keep shows going, but we now are living in a time where we are constantly bombarded with shows. There is constantly something new coming out. The stream of entertainment just doesn't end. So what happens when commercial interest takes over? We get soulless shows that are made as cash grabs. I feel like nowadays there is just this huge urgency to rush things out and just to stay on top. This even applies to me in some way. There is, after all, a reason as to why this video is hitting you sooner rather than later. And I think that this is the mentality that spawns many shows that are good for one season, but then they rapidly decline because they just weren't entirely designed to go on. Damn, some shows weren't even designed to go on beyond the pilot episode. I certainly understand the impulse in trying to produce as much content as possible, but it is that impulse that becomes detrimental to the creative process needed to sustain shows, or movies, or whatever. Severance, however, is not like that. The show will have immense respect for me just for the fact that it feels like whoever is making the show first actually sat down and put in thought and effort. The second season, if anything, proves perfectly that some of the things truly were planned way in advance, because that is how it should be. I really have come to hate the mentality of trying to expand things that shouldn't be expanded. Let's be real, creativity, as much as someone would like to tell you otherwise, has its limits. A narrative, a setting, whatever, everything has its limits. And it is best to recognize those limits rather than try and have an ego about it and prove that you can go beyond them. Which is exactly how Severance operates, I feel like. It has thought in there. It doesn't extend itself into places it shouldn't. It has a defined lane and sticks to it. It is why the twists work so well. They are so in line with the show itself, but I don't feel like the show would be mad at you if you figured out those twists yourself. Because the show isn't after trying to become viral online or with the most shocking twistiest twist ever. It is there to tell a good, well thought out story first. So no, I am not going to chastise the show too much over its problems. It might have some, but I am more than willing to overlook them, because nothing is ever perfect, and the show itself certainly doesn't pretend to be. Maybe I'm just digging in too deep here, but I am the type of person who just really responds to this type of storytelling. I am not ashamed to admit that my own perception becomes colored if I sense a TV show is horsing around too much. You can simply tell when something is made without soul or thought, and it is disrespectful to assume audiences cannot distinguish that. And it doesn't even feel like it is hard to earn the goodwill that Severance has earned. Because even if some storylines weren't resolved now, I am willing to wait, because I feel like the show has earned some trust, especially after the second season, that the wait will be worth it. It is not that hard to just spend some time and think about what you're writing, and I won't pretend otherwise. It is a bit disheartening to realize that Severance is not the rule, but rather the exception. It is not like the other shows, but again, it is an outlier, and that is just really disappointing. So enough of me rambling. Come on, off your trot. If you haven't watched the show, go ahead and do it now. If you have, go rewatch it, because why the hell not? It's fun, it's great.